She married him to save her reputation. He married her because no one else would have him. The scandal was not Mave Torrance's fault, but the scandal did not care whose fault it was. Scandals in small towns operate like weather. They arrive without permission, damage without discrimination, and leave behind a landscape that looks different from the one that existed before. What happened was this. Mave had been seen leaving the office of Dr. Clement Fossey at 10 o'clock at night. She had been there because she had a toothache that had escalated from an inconvenience to an emergency over the course of the evening. And Dr. Fossey was the only medical man in Redtail, Nebraska, and he had opened his office as a favor because the tooth was abscessed and waiting until morning was not an option. The visit lasted 40 minutes. Dr. Fossey examined the swelling, administered a dose of laudanum for the pain, and extracted the tooth with the practiced efficiency of a man who had pulled more teeth than he could count in 20 years of frontier medicine. Mave paid $2 and walked home in the dark with a mouth full of cotton and a jaw full of laudanum, and no idea that Mrs. Delphine Krieger was watching from the window of the boarding house across the street. Mrs. Krieger was the kind of woman who processed information the way a mill processes grain, taking in raw material, grinding it, and producing a product that bore little resemblance to what went in. By the time the story left Mrs. Krieger's boarding house the next morning, the toothache had disappeared, the cotton had disappeared, the $2 payment had disappeared, and what remained was a 26-year-old unmarried woman leaving a man's office at 10 o'clock at night, which in Redtail, Nebraska, in 1887, was a verdict that required no trial. Mave learned about the story the way most people learn about the stories told about them. From the silence. The silence at the general store when she walked in. The silence at church when she sat down. The turned backs, the averted eyes. The particular quality of quiet that descends when a community has decided something about a person and does not intend to reconsider. She was 26, slim and fair-haired, the daughter of a school teacher who had died when Mave was 19 and a mother who had died when she was 12, leaving her in the care of an aunt who had provided a roof and meals but not affection, and who had died herself the previous year, leaving Mave alone in a 2-room house on Elm Street that she owned outright but could not maintain on the income from her work as a laundress, which paid enough for food and firewood and soap, but not for the roof repairs that the house needed, or the fence that was leaning, or the 100 small expenses that accumulate when a house is aging and its owner has no margin, which was the only work available to an unmarried woman in Redtail, whose reputation had just been destroyed by a toothache. The laundry work disappeared within a week. The women of Redtail did not want their laundry washed by a woman of questionable character, because character in a small town is contagious. It transfers through proximity, through association, through the handling of undergarments that belong to respectable families. Mave lost the Krieger account first, which was ironic in a way that was too bitter to be funny. She lost the Paulson account next, then the Drakes, then the minister's wife, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable when she said she would be making other arrangements. By the second week, Mave had no income, no prospects, and a reputation that preceded her into every room she entered like a cold draft. She had also exhausted her anger, not because the anger was unjustified, but because anger requires energy, and energy requires food, and food requires money, and money requires work, and work requires a reputation, and the circle was complete and airtight, and she was inside it. Emmett Cole lived 4 miles north of Redtail on a quarter section of prairie that he farmed alone. He was 38, tall, with a face that had been broken by a horse kick when he was 20, and had healed crooked, leaving him with a jaw that sat slightly off-center, and a nose that pointed in a direction it had not originally intended. The face was not ugly. It was simply the kind of face that people looked away from, not out of revulsion, but out of the discomfort that comes from seeing evidence of damage that has not been fully repaired. And the looking away had accumulated over 18 years into a loneliness that Emmett wore the way he wore his coat, habitually, without comment, as though it were simply part of the equipment required for living. He had never married, not because he had never wanted to, but because the women of Redtail and the surrounding county had decided, through the collective judgment that small communities render without formal proceedings, that Emmett Cole was not marriage material. He was too quiet. His face was too broken. His farm was too far from town. He did not attend dances because he did not dance, and because the one dance he had attended, 5 years ago, he had stood against the wall for 2 hours, while the room arranged itself around his absence, and the standing had been worse than not going. He did not attend socials because he did not socialize. He attended church and the general store and the feed dealer and his own quarter section of prairie, and the circuit between those 4 points was the full circumference of his life. He heard about Mave's situation the way he heard about everything, late, incompletely, and through the filter of people who assumed he was not interested. Emmett was not a man the town brought news to. He was a man the town brought feed orders to, and occasionally weather predictions, and the kind of information that one shares with a fence post, not because the fence post will respond, but because the habit of talking requires a target. He heard it at the feed store from Orrin Hatch, who mentioned it not as gossip, but as a footnote to a conversation about grain prices, the way a man mentions weather, factually, without investment. "The Torrance woman is in trouble," Orrin said. "Lost all her laundry accounts. Mrs. Krieger says she was at Fosse's office in the night. Was she sick? Toothache, she says. Then she was sick. That is not what Redtail says. Redtail is wrong." Emmett thought about it for 3 days. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, slowly, thoroughly, with the patient deliberation of a man who plows in straight lines and does not rush the turning at the end of the row. On the 4th day, a Sunday, he hitched his wagon and drove to Redtail and knocked on the door of the house that Mave Torrance owned outright and could not maintain. Mave opened the door. She looked at Emmett Cole, whom she knew by sight and by name, and by the reputation for quietness that was his equivalent of her reputation for scandal, a label applied by the community and accepted by default because fighting labels requires a kind of energy that neither of them had in surplus. "Mr. Cole, Miss Torrance, I have a proposition. It is not the kind of proposition that your current situation might suggest. It is a straightforward proposal." "Of what?" "Marriage." Mave looked at him. She looked at the crooked jaw and the misdirected nose and the eyes, which were gray and steady and entirely without guile. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the silence between them became a space where honesty could exist. "Why?" she asked. "Because you need a husband and I need a wife, and neither of us is likely to find one through conventional means. Your reputation is damaged. My face is damaged. Between us, we have one working reputation and one working face, which is not ideal, but is more than either of us has alone." It was, Mave would later reflect, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. It was also the least romantic, but romance was a luxury she could not afford, and honesty was a currency she had been spending without return for 2 weeks, and here was a man who dealt in it. "You understand that the toothache was real," she said. "I do." "You understand that nothing happened at Dr. Fosse's office except dentistry." "I do." "And you are willing to marry a woman the town believes is ruined." "The town believes many things. Most of them are wrong. I have been the subject of the town's beliefs for 18 years, and I can tell you that the town's beliefs are not facts. They are stories. Stories can be replaced." They married the following week, on a Tuesday afternoon that was overcast and cold, at the courthouse, with the clerk and his assistant as witnesses. Mave wore her best dress, which was also the dress she wore to do laundry, and Emmett wore his church coat, which fit him the way church coats fit men who buy them once and wear them for decades, tightly in some places and loosely in others, the coat and the man having grown in different directions over time. The ride to the farm was 4 miles of silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have made a practical decision and are allowing the decision to settle into their bodies the way a new tool settles into the hand, gradually, through use, until the unfamiliarity becomes familiarity, and the familiarity becomes something closer to belonging. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, a kitchen, a porch, a barn that needed paint, a garden that needed planting, a well that worked and never ran dry, a cast iron stove that worked, a bed in the bedroom that Emmett offered to Mave while he took the pallet in the main room, and the offering was made with the same matter-of-fact honesty that had characterized every word he had spoken since he knocked on her door. "This is your home now," he said. "I will not ask anything of you that you do not wish to give. The arrangement is practical. If it becomes something more, that will be your decision, not mine." Mave stood in the kitchen of the cabin 4 miles north of Redtail and looked at the man who had married her to save her reputation, and who asked nothing in return, and who had a face that the world looked away from, and a heart that the world had not bothered to look at, and she felt the first small fracture in the wall she had built around herself since Mrs. Krieger's window. The arrangement was practical. For 2 weeks, it was nothing but practical. Mave cooked and cleaned and planted the garden and tended the chickens that Emmett bought in town because he thought she might want chickens, and did not ask first because he was better at doing things than asking about things. Emmett plowed and planted and mended fences and split firewood and hauled water and repaired the barn door that had been hanging crooked for a year, because a man alone does not fix what only a man alone will see, and came home each evening to a house that smelled like food and looked like someone lived in it. And the transformation of the cabin from a place where a man slept to a place where 2 people lived was so rapid and so complete that it seemed less like change and more like correction, as though the cabin had always been waiting for a second person and was relieved to finally have one. They talked in the evenings, slowly at first, the cautious exchanges of strangers who share a roof, and then with increasing depth, the way a well produces water once the drilling reaches the aquifer. Emmett told her about the horse kick, a 3-year-old gelding that caught him on the jaw while he was cleaning a hoof, the sound of the bone breaking, the weeks of healing with his jaw wired shut, the face that emerged when the wires came off. He told it without self-pity, the way he told everything, as a fact that had shaped his life, but did not define it. Mave told him about the toothache. She told him about Mrs. Krieger's window. She told him about the silence at the general store, and the silence at church, and the particular cruelty of a community that punishes without evidence, because punishment is easier than investigation, and more satisfying than justice. "You are angry," Emmett said. "I was. I am tired now. Tired is what comes after angry. After tired comes something else. What comes after tired? I do not know yet. I have been tired for 18 years. I am still waiting to find out." Mave laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 3 weeks, and the sound surprised them both. A real laugh, unguarded and warm, provoked not by a joke, but by the particular comedy of 2 damaged people sitting at a kitchen table in a cabin on the prairie, and discovering that damage, shared honestly, is funnier than either of them expected. The something else arrived in March. It arrived on a morning when the prairie was still brown, but the sky was blue, with the particular blue of approaching spring, the blue that promises green without delivering it yet. Emmett was harnessing the plow horse, and Mave brought him coffee, and their hands touched on the cup, and neither of them pulled away, and the not pulling away was the moment, the hinge, the point at which the arrangement stopped being practical and became personal. They did not discuss it. They did not need to. The language of their marriage had been honesty from the beginning, and the honesty had expanded to include silences that meant as much as words. And the silence that surrounded the cup of coffee and the touching of hands was the loudest silence either of them had ever heard. They were both people who understood things through action rather than declaration, and the actions that followed, his hand on her shoulder when he passed her in the kitchen, her hand straightening his collar before church, the pallet in the main room folded up and put away without comment, said everything that needed saying. Redtail noticed. Redtail noticed the way small towns notice everything, completely, belatedly, and with opinions. Mrs. Krieger declared that Mave had trapped Emmett, which was the kind of statement that Mrs. Krieger specialized in, and that no one with sense took seriously. The minister's wife returned with her laundry, which Mave declined to accept because she no longer needed the income, and because declining was its own form of justice, and she had earned it. The man with the broken face and the woman with the broken reputation built a life on a quarter section of Nebraska prairie that the world had overlooked. The cabin grew, a third room added in summer, a fourth the following spring, when Mave's belly made it clear that the cabin would need space for someone smaller. The garden grew, pushing its borders outward each year like a green declaration of permanence. The marriage grew in the way that prairie grass grows, not dramatically, not with the showiness of garden flowers, but deeply, the roots going down where no one could see them, anchoring everything above. And the stories that Redtail told about both of them were replaced, gradually and without ceremony, by the only story that mattered, which was the one they were writing together, in the quiet language of two people who had been alone long enough to know what together was worth.